Great pleasure to have you here at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. All right, and hopefully we have everyone in from the digital waiting room. So let's go ahead and begin. My name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English here at the University of Tulsa and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which is the host for this evening's event. I'm going to say just a few words about the Humanities Center, about our mission and our work, and then turn it over to my colleague and one of our fellows in the center this year to introduce tonight's speaker. So for those who don't know, the Humanities Center essentially has a twofold mission here at the University of Tulsa. On the one hand, we serve as a think tank here on campus, where we select a theme each year that we think can only be fully and richly addressed using the distinctive tools of the arts and humanities. Throughout this academic year, perhaps somewhat optimistically, we've been exploring the theme of renewal and recovery. We've explored topics in the past like privacy and humor and homeland, and next year we'll be exploring the topic of freedom. In order to do this work, we convene a group of faculty, students, and members of the community, and we bring them together to work as a kind of a think tank on campus. They meet intensively throughout the fall semester and help us design programming that then carries over into the rest of the year. And then in addition, we host usually between 30 and 35 public programs each year. These range from talks like the one you're joining this evening to exhibitions, performances, and much, much more. You can always learn more about the work, about our programming and upcoming events by visiting us at humanities.utulsa.edu or by following us on our various social media platforms. This is, in fact, our final renewal event, themed event this evening. So it's a bit bittersweet always when we bring these themes to an end, though I'm delighted that we're able to welcome such an eminent and innovative scholar for tonight's event. I do want to call your attention to a couple of upcoming events that we do have scheduled at the Humanities Center. On the 6th of May, we'll round out our academic programming for the year with the annual TU Arts and Humanities Festival, which will take place at the Zero Center in the Arts District at TU's downtown cultural hub. This will be in conjunction with Mayfest, so there will be 100,000 people most likely down there, but you'll be able to come into the Zero Center where admission is always free and find an incredible exhibition of student work, of student performances, student films. Poets will be sitting out on the street from among our student body here who will write you a poem on demand on any topic you might wish. It'll just be a fun and exciting way to show off the enormous talent of the students that we have here at TU. As I mentioned, we'll then be kicking off our annual theme of freedom in June, when on June 16th, we are going to host serve as a co-sponsor and co-host of TU's annual Juneteenth celebrations, which mark the official end of slavery in the United States. This is a sort of Black Independence Day, or a sort of Independence Day born out of the end of slavery that allows us all to celebrate the distinctive nature of American freedom. This will take place at the Zero Center. We'll have exhibitions, performances, live drawing classes, music, and much, much more that will run throughout the months of June and July. And this will then lead us into a whole year's worth of programming on freedom that will deal with topics including Oklahoma's historical all-Black towns, the consequences and sort of cultural legacies and precursors of the McGirt decision, the musical legacies of the Dust Bowl, and more. We do each year welcome public fellows to the center. So these are people from outside of TU who don't have a direct affiliation with the university as either faculty or students to join us in this seminar that I mentioned at the outset. We'll be opening up applications for that soon. So if you have interest in the topic of freedom, we'll be able to pay, for the first time, we'll be able to pay $2,000 stipends to fellows who are able to participate in the seminar from outside TU. So again, visit us at humanities.utulsa.edu for more information about all of these events. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to one of our Renewal and Recovery Fellows, Professor Don James McLaughlin, my colleague in the Department of English here, who's been doing much of this work throughout the year. He's actually been an enormous help in helping us program and design exciting programs this year. And so it's my great pleasure to turn the mic over to him so he can introduce Professor Sonia Hazard this evening. So Don James, please.
Welcome. It's a privilege that I've been looking forward to for a long time to be able to welcome Dr. Sonia Hazard to the University of Tulsa, Assistant Professor of Religion at Florida State University, where she specializes in the history of religious movements and material texts in 19th century America. She has a book that is forthcoming from Oxford University Press next year, which is called Building Evangelical America: How the American Tract Society Laid the Groundwork for a religious revolution. So be on the lookout for that. I also want to mention a couple of articles that she's published, which I think are some of the most incredible articles that I have read in recent years that are doing really innovative things methodologically with how we think about the materiality of literary texts. So one is titled Evangelical Encounters: The American Tract Society and the Rituals of Print Distribution in Antebellum America, which is published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion in 2020. And the other is How Joseph Smith Discovered Printing Plates and Founded Mormonism, which was printed in Religion and American Culture last year in 2021. Before I first met Sonia, when we were living in Philadelphia and finishing our graduate work at the same time, a colleague asked me, "Have you met Sonia Hazard?" And I said, "I haven't." And he said, "Nobody talks about the material past in the 19th century the way Sonia does. Nobody paints as vivid a scene of what was the actual environment that people interacted in and published their materials in the 19th century." And when I met Sonia and started hearing her ask excellent questions at events that we both attended, that it immediately became clear what this colleague was talking about. One of the reasons Dr. Hazard is so good at painting vivid scenes of the spaces and interactions that she's interested in is that the idea of the encounter between people, encounter between peoples and objects, is something that fascinates her and that she spent a lot of time theorizing. I'd like to read just a few lines that I think represent what's so exceptional about Dr. Hazard's theorization of this concept of the encounter. She says in one of her articles, "Encounter is a term that remains under-theorized despite its frequency of use. I use it to mean that to encounter something or someone, whether an object, a space, a person, a mood, is to enter into the other's field of force, and thus to assemble with the other, be made vulnerable to change in oneself, and become different. Such encounters expand the field of what was before possible." When I was rereading these lines in preparation for this event, it struck me that the encounter, as she describes it, is exactly what it feels like to be in Dr. Hazard's presence and to be able to discuss ideas with her. We had the chance to live in Worcester, Massachusetts in 2019 at the same time when we were both long-term fellows of the American Antiquarian Society. And I often look back on the conversations that we had and remember how attentive she is to everything that is involved in an encounter, not just the people present, although definitely the people present, but also the environment, the affect, the various spatial parameters of that moment. And I know I speak for many when I say that that attentiveness to everything that goes into an encounter makes interacting with Sonia in these various contexts an incredibly rewarding experience. So with that, it's again my privilege to be welcoming Dr. Hazard today.
Okay, can you hear me? This is working. Well, thank you for that totally embarrassing and overly generous introduction, Don James. I appreciate that so much. And thank you all for being here this evening. I've been a really long time admirer of the programming you have here at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. So this is especially exciting for me. I'm also honored because my research concerns history very local to this area. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge our local circumstances. The city of Tulsa occupies land and uses the resources of the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and the Osage Nation. And I'm very grateful to be here on these lands and share some ideas with you tonight. The object of my talk is this pair of Cherokee language editions of a tract called Poor Sarah, or The Indian Woman. This was a widely reprinted tract in both America and England in the 19th century. Poor Sarah narrates the encounters of the author. She's a white woman named Phoebe Brown with Sarah, an elderly indigenous woman and convert to Christianity living in Connecticut. The plot centers on Sarah's quest for English language literacy. It also presents Sarah as unfailingly cheerful despite her poverty. The image on the title page, for instance, depicts her practice of giving grapes to the white village children despite having hardly anything to eat for herself. I was at an archive in Boston, it's called the Boston Athenaeum, when I came upon these two Cherokee language editions of Poor Sarah, and they were bound into the same volume, which immediately caught my attention because it was a very awkward binding job. Here's this really big tract, and it was bound next to this tiny little tract. And so here they are again at scale. The ruler through the middle is in centimeters. The differing orientations of the image also jumped out at me. You know, why is this image from 1843 getting turned 90 degrees so that it's now crowded into this tiny little space of the page? And to really get a good look at the image, you'd have to either crane your neck weirdly or, you know, manipulate it in your hands. So on top of that, I also knew that the interval between these two editions was the time of Indian removal in the United States. Cherokee citizens were forced on the Trail of Tears from 1838 through 39, and the tracts were manufactured on either side of that profoundly disruptive and violent forced migration. The first tract was in New Echota, which was the capital of Cherokee Nation, which is now in present-day Georgia, kind of like northwestern Georgia. And the second was in the town of Park Hill, in what was then Indian Territory, which is now part of today's Cherokee Nation. Park Hill is about an hour's drive east of here, as I understand. It's 5 miles south of Tahlequah. I wanted to know what is going on here. Why is the material format of this text getting rethought and revised so dramatically during a period of removal? The content of the text stays the same. So why has its materiality changed so dramatically? What does its evolving material form mean, and what is that material form doing to readers and viewers of the tract? The theme of the Humanities Center this year is recovery and renewal. Poor Sarah exemplifies this theme. In 1843, Cherokee printers are recovering this earlier edition. You know, they're doing a calling back to 1833, but they're also doing it in this brand new way. You know, they're renewing it. So what's at stake in that renewal? Why are they renewing it in this way? My hypothesis was that these two material formats were doing different work, and the whole puzzle was what? Like, why? Why are they doing this? Why are they going to so much trouble to make this new object? I'm going to provide some context before delving into that question. Some of this context may be quite familiar to members of this audience, so if that's you, bear with me. Cherokees had many forms of recording before they had European-style writing. These included media like storytelling, landmarks, and wampum. Starting in 1821, however, they also had writing. The inventor was the brilliant Sequoyah, shown here, who with his young daughter created what's called a syllabary. And a syllabary means that each character corresponds to syllables in the spoken language. The Cherokee syllabary has 86 characters, and by all accounts, Cherokees learned it very quickly, and literacy rates absolutely soared. There's a census taken in 1835, so that's just 14 years after Sequoyah's invention. There's 15,000 or so citizens of Cherokee Nation in the East, and of those, almost 4,000 were readers of the syllabary. So that's a huge, huge growth just in, a decade and a half. One of the factors contributing to the uptake of literacy was printing. In 1826, the Cherokee government resolved to establish a national press. And they received some assistance on this front in getting the press from a major missionary organization in the 19th century. It's called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or this very awkward acronym, ABCFM. If you say it enough, it kind of rolls off your tongue. By 1828, the printing office in New Echota opens with that ABCFM assistance with an iron hand press that probably looked a lot like this one. So in addition to the press, they also get a full set of types in Sequoyah's syllabary. And the types would have looked something like this. So this is me. I'm setting types at the Book Arts Press at the University of Virginia. And I'm setting Roman types, like standard English language Roman types. But the types would have looked much the same, these little types, and the composition process was much the same. This is a type specimen sheet, otherwise known as a proof sheet, and it shows what the print characters looked like. I could say a whole lot more about these types. There's a librarian named William Thomas who's done a lot of work on this. And just one interesting thing is that basically the ABCFM wanted Cherokees to print using the Roman type for obvious reasons, like it'd be easier for missionaries to deal with. And the Cherokee government basically said, like, no, thank you. Like, if we don't print in the syllabary, we're not gonna print at all. And basically, like their arm was squeezed, and the ABCFM said, okay, fine, we'll print in, we'll help you get the types in the syllabary. And so the types were sent to Cherokee Nation, and printing in Cherokee Nation commences in the syllabary. So there's been a lot of really excellent scholarship on printing in New Echota, but almost all of it has focused on this newspaper. It's called the Cherokee Phoenix. It was the first bilingual newspaper in North America, and it is truly remarkable. There's a lot to say about it. But what scholars have not yet analyzed are the Christian tracts that also came off this press, and this despite the fact that Christian pamphlets were a major part of the publishing program, and they were the majority of pamphlets that came off the press at the same time as this newspaper was being printed. So in the period of the press's activity, which is 1828 to 1834, Cherokees print 15 pamphlets in addition to kind of ongoing printing of the newspaper. And of these 15 pamphlets, 9 are Christian materials, or what I'm calling tracts. So these are parts of the Bible, they're hymn books, there's a liturgical book, and then there's also Poor Sarah, which is the only narrative tract that they're printing. When scholars have mentioned the Christian tracts, and really just in passing, they have generally assumed that they were really produced by white missionaries. There's a tendency to kind of wave them away as regrettable evidence of missionary control. The problem with that is that it's not accurate. Cherokees exerted leadership in every position in the printing office, and they were instrumentally involved in what was printed and how things were printed. Here are some typical examples of tracts of the period. So on the left is an edition of Cherokee hymns, and on the right is the Gospel of Matthew. So just a little piece of the Bible, just the Gospel of Matthew. I know there's a lot to see here, but in the red boxes, I want to call attention to some of the most important people in the printing office. And there's 4 people in particular to kind of keep in your brain if possible. The 2 main translators are Samuel Worcester. So he's a white missionary with the ABCFM. His name appears first here in the red box on the left. And also Elias Boudinot. He's a Cherokee statesman, and his name typically appears second. So they're the 2 main translators, they're leaders in the print shop, and they're typically collaborating together on almost all of these publications. I'm going to be saying a lot more about Boudinot just in a minute. And then there's 2 main head pressmen in the office, and these are the people who actually set the type and printed it. And similarly, this was one white guy and one Cherokee guy. So these are John Candy, and that's his name there in the left blue oval. He's a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And then John Wheeler is the one on the right. Wheeler was originally hired by the Cherokee government to kind of bring the art of printing to Cherokee Nation. And the goal was to train Cherokees like Candy in the art of printing and to kind of bring them up in the office. There's also several Cherokee apprentices who are basically teenagers who don't really appear in the historical record very much. But Candy, on the contrary, becomes a very, very skilled printer. And he kind of quickly raises to the level of his teacher, and they eventually become kind of partners. And then this tract in 1832, this is the first tract in Cherokee Nation that is just printed by Candy alone. So right, I think I've identified this as like the first publication printed by a Cherokee person working alone, or at least credited alone. That's 1832. And then, excuse me. Okay, so we've got Worcester, Boudinot, Candy, and Wheeler. Another crucial historical context to sketch out is white settler colonization and Indian removal. So Cherokees on the eve of their removal were living in their sovereign nation that had already been reduced by a whole lot in the decades following the revolution. At the time that Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act into law in 1830, Cherokee Nation covered this kind of maroon smudge that you see in the map. At the time of the revolution, it was about 10 times this amount, and it was reduced decade by decade, chipping away because of these punitive treaties in the wake of the revolution. Cherokees fought removal tooth and nail. Scholars have done a whole lot of work on this. They fought in the Supreme Court twice. And then as they do so, the Georgia state militia becomes increasingly harassing and violent, and including to the print shop and the printers. In 1834, the Georgia Guard illegally rushes the printing office. They confiscate the press, and tragically, they scatter the types. And this is the set of types in the syllabary that exists. So once the types are scattered, there's no more printing in Cherokee Nation after that. Then over 1838 through 39 is the Trail of Tears. So right where that blue line originates, that's where New Echota is. That's the capital of Cherokee Nation and where the print shop is. And then, as is well known, they moved to forced migration to Indian Territory. So that's the context. These threads of printing and Indian removal both come together in one man, really fascinating person named Elias Boudinot. He's also the translator of Poor Sarah. There is a whole lot written about him in the history books, but just a little sketch of him. He's born in Galagana. He attends a missionary school in Cherokee Nation, which renamed all of its pupils with the names of well-known white Christians. So Boudinot gets named, Boudinot, the student, Cherokee student, gets renamed after the well-known New Jersey evangelical who's president of the American Bible Society, Elias Boudinot. Boudinot, the younger, the Cherokee, was a star student, and he was then sent to receive an education at the so-called heathen school in Connecticut. And that's where he formally affiliates with Christianity. He's also deeply involved with publishing in Cherokee Nation. He led the fundraising effort for the press. He goes on the speaking tour of all these Northeastern churches, funds the press. He's the first editor of the Phoenix newspaper. And then he and Worcester is that white ABCFM missionary. They work together on almost all of the pamphlet translations. He's equally involved in national politics, and he was a leader initially in the fight against removal. He was also, and this is really important for what followed, he's among a group of Cherokees who promoted a certain strategy to win white settler recognition of their sovereignty and offer greater possibilities to remain on their land, which was to perform a kind of white settler style civilization, with like civilization in huge quotes, which basically meant assimilating as much as possible, at least in kind of outward performance, to Anglo-Protestant norms. And scholars have emphasized that Boudinot's Christianity was a part of that performance, which is not to say it's not sincere, or genuine. Like, I don't care about those questions, but it was a signal of assimilation. In the midst of his political work on behalf of Cherokee Nation, Boudinot embarked on Poor Sarah, which I believe was his passion project. Up until this point, he had worked on translations always with Worcester, but Poor Sarah is the first and also the only project that he did solo. And you can see in this yellow box that he's credited alone working there, translated by E. Boudinot. Worcester was actually away at the time. He was in prison for a while. One of the things that happened is that the state of Georgia had demanded that all white people living within the state swear an oath to Georgia as like a loyalty test. And Worcester was one of two missionaries who was a holdout. And he was eventually incarcerated for, I believe, 18 months. So what's interesting is that Worcester gets taken out of the print shop where he and Boudinot had always done this work together. And while Worcester is gone, Boudinot does this project of Poor Sarah. So that's salient to me. And when Worcester is gone, not only does he do Poor Sarah, but he does some really unusual things with it, things that don't track with what what had been going on in the print shop up until that point. One way to think about the significance of any single printed object is to consider it in relation to its larger media landscape. It's just like a fancy way of saying like other objects kind of like it in its same class. How is it like or unlike other media? So when I've done that, when I've compared it to what was coming off the press at the time, what I found is that Boudinot's Poor Sarah was exceptional among the Christian pamphlets that came off the new Echota press. So here it is on the right, and then it's compared at scale to tracts that were much more typical on the left. So here's again that Cherokee hymns, and there's Gospel of Matthew, but I put them on the slide at scale compared to Poor Sarah. So even just at a glance, we can say, one, the scale of Poor Sarah is huge comparatively. It's about double the surface area of the others. Most of the tracts that were coming off the press were about the size of an index card, these kind of like miniature little things, whereas Poor Sarah is more like the size of a small paperback book. So that's weird. Like, why is he doing that? It also includes an image. So that's different. That's quite different. Boudinot was making unusual decisions regarding the format of Poor Sarah. So again, like with kind of a little bit more refinement, what is this format doing? Why? I want to elaborate just for a short time. And this is like my media studies nerdery, but I want to elaborate on the concept of format, which has been helpful for me in thinking through what is going on here. I use the concept of format because I think that format helps draw attention to decisions that makers of media made regarding the materiality of their publications and in ways intended to shape those publications' distribution and reception. I'm taking cues from how scholars of both historical and digital media have been theorizing format, especially my intellectual North Stars have been Meredith McGill and Jonathan Stern. Stern, who has this image in his wonderful book, MP3, The Meaning of a Format, which I've just ripped off here, talks about the MP3. And you remember the MP3? It's a compressed audio file that many of us used to download legally or illegally. Yeah. So Stern writes about how MP3s sacrifice audio quality in the interest of transmissibility. To make an MP3, an encoder, which is kind of a machine, as I understand, like a machine like this one, takes an audio file and discards the parts of it that are not likely to be audible. In order to make, the goal is to make a more lithe, a kind of more supple file that can then hurtle through the internet more quickly. What's germane to me is that there's theories about markets, there's theories about the limits of human perception, and there's theories about what listeners want that are all built into the making of the MP3. They're kind of like in the DNA of the MP3. The MP3 is a production decision that affects and anticipates the conditions of its circulation and reception. Here's just a little more Stern, just like a little bit. He says this: format denotes a whole range of decisions that affect the look, feel, experience, and workings of a medium. The format is what specifies the protocols by which a medium will operate. This specification operates as a code that conditions the experience of a medium and its processing protocols. These kinds of codes are not publicly discussed or even apparent to end users. So that's a lot of digital speak, but what I take from Stern is that format is just not only a name for the bare physicality of any kind of media object, whether that's an MP3 or a tract, any more than it is just a name for like just the algorithm that encodes an audio format or an audio file. Format is rather about a whole range of production decisions about materiality and how those things affect and anticipate situations of distribution and reception. It encompasses how material qualities made arguments and had effects on users. And then this is really interesting to me too, even though those users might not even be aware of the effects that are happening on them. As he says at the end here, these kinds of codes are not publicly discussed or even apparent to end users. So there's something about format that kind of fades to the background, that does not announce itself, but that nonetheless has these effects. That's a kind of quality that I tend to think is particularly efficient for politics, to not even get people to kind of reflect on what is happening to them. I also like format because 19th century printers also had format in their own sense. By that term, they were referring to the number of leaves produced from a sheet of paper on the printing press. There's a really different technical definition, but that encompasses some of the same theoretical sensibilities. So what you're looking at is an image of type that has been set up and is ready for printing. And it's formatted in quarto, otherwise known as formo, which just means that there's 4 leaves to a sheet. So the 1833 printing of Porcera, the one that Boudinot did in New Echota, that's formatted in duodecimo or 12mo. So you have to imagine, instead of 4 here, it would be like 12. 12mo was super common. It was the size of most Anglophone pamphlets and novels at that time. But all of the other pamphlets in New Echota were 24mo, so 24. So, instead of 4, it would be 24 tiny little pages that are set up here. The pages are even smaller. And 24mo was actually a very unusual format by the standards of the Anglophone book market at the time. That sort of miniature scale was associated mostly with just children's literature. Children's books in the 19th century were pretty much the inverse of what children's books are today, which are big, which is actually a weird idea because what it means is that they're really manipulable only by adults. But the thinking in the 19th century, which makes more sense, is that you have these little books which are for little hands, and children can kind of carry them with them and share them with their friends. It's kind of a more child-friendly size. But this was unusual, and the Cherokee 12mo are kind of more like this, which is not a typical Anglophone convention. Bringing Stern's insights to bear on this older sense of format brings focus to how deciding whether to print in 24mo or 12mo was likewise a production decision about materiality that theorized circulation and reception. These Cherokee printers' formatting choices were not random. They were not neutral. On the contrary, they were anticipating certain kinds of readers, and they were intended to have certain effects on those readers. So back to Boudinot. In dramatically departing from the formats of other tracts that came off the press, Boudinot was clearly basing his Porcera off the edition of the same tract, which I'm going to show you in a second, produced by the American Tract Society, or the ATS. So the ATS is the subject of my first book. It's coming out with Oxford next year. The ATS was this massive, truly massive evangelical publishing powerhouse based in New York. And they published just millions and millions of tracts that looked like this on the left here. For people who like numbers like I do, between their founding in 1825 and the Civil War in 1861, they published 5.6 billion pages of print. So that number is supposed to stun you. It's like a lot. It's like, as culture industries go, it's like really, really big. The ATS did this because they wanted to convert the country to evangelical Protestantism, and they really thought they could. They wanted to put a tract in the hands of every man, woman, and child. So what you're looking at here is this is a vignette that decorates an early certificate of membership. And it's really an idealized version of what they thought would happen, where they've got these angels with the press in the middle. And what the angels are doing is they're just like spreading the tracts to all of the people. And the people in the back are like just ready for them, putting their hands up, ready to take the tracts. Okay, why does this matter? The ATS also reprinted Porcera a lot. As this comparison begins to show, Boudinot was imitating the format of Porcera very, very closely. To enumerate the similarities. One, they have the same format in that older sense of bibliographical format. They're both duodecimo or 12mo, so their dimensions are virtually the same. The image, there we go, is also pulled from the exact same block. Which means that somehow this block was physically sent from New York to New Echota. The typography is also really similar. When you start kind of looking at this thing for a really long time, you start to notice that even the subtitle, for instance, where it says the Indian woman, Cherokee printers had used this very nearly identical italicized typeface, also in all caps. And these lovely kind of tails to the letters are Typographers call those swashes. So they're using this very similar typeface with these fancy exaggerated swashes. They both have a pull quote caption right below the image. And the point of this was to kind of catch your attention with the image and then pull you into the text. So you see the image, then your eye would go down, see the pull quote caption, and you would then open the tract to page 6 or page 8. And then the imprint is also arranged in a triangle shape. This triangle shape was classic ATS. The ATS itself was citing kind of how colophons look like in medieval and early modern European books. But the ATS is doing it. It's like a really distinctive formatting element in these 19th century cheap tracts. And these printers in New Echota are doing the exact same thing. Kind of imperfectly because of how the line breaks work out, but they're clearly kind of attending to how that triangular shape looks. All of this to me suggests that Boudinot and the printers clearly had the ATS prototype kind of like right there while they were preparing their edition in New Echota. One little aside though, just because they're consulting the ATS copy does not mean that there was no innovation. One interesting detail, and I apologize because this image doesn't show it super clearly, but I promise it's there, is if you see on this side on the right, that's the New Echotan edition, kind of radiating to the upwards left from Sarah's head are these 3 little white dots. You kind of see that? You'll have to take my word for it if you don't see it super clearly. But what that is that that's not a random pattern at all. Somebody had taken like some kind of burin or some sharp tool, like a knife, and they had nicked 3 little dots, like just like that. The block wouldn't have broken this way. So I don't know what this means. If anyone has any ideas, I'm all ears. I'm inclined to think of it as a kind of like signature mark, kind of like when this block comes from New York to New Echota, they're making it their own in this really subtle way. But I just don't know. But there is some kind of innovation. It's not like a direct copy, but there's a citational practice going on and a renewal. Yeah, a renewal. So I think it's within the realm of possibility that Boudinot was in communication with the ATS and that the ATS wanted the tract to look like this in exchange for supplying the block. And to go back to our green triangles here, the imprint information on the New Echota edition, bottom right, seems to support this. The imprint says this: published by the United Brethren's Missionary Society, that's the Moravian Missionary Society, at the expense of the American Tract Society, Wheeler and Candy printers. My argument is that this attribution to the Moravians and to the ATS is a deliberate misdirection. I don't think that Boudinot was talking to the ATS at all. For reasons that I elaborate on in my book, despite the ATS's stated goal of trying to reach every man, woman, and child, they actually almost exclusively cared about converting US citizens, which is to say white people. As a result, they didn't actually address Indigenous people very often. The publisher rarely attempted to print in Indigenous languages, and they gave very, very few donations to Indigenous missions. I mean, comparatively, they were giving 10 times the amount of donations to like naval ships than they were to all Indian missions combined. It was just not a priority for them. Moreover, in direct contradiction to the imprint's claim, there are absolutely 0 records of ATS cash donations to Cherokee Nation in all the years surrounding Poor Sarah's publication, which makes me think that giving Cherokee Nation the woodblock to print the image was really the extent of ATS involvement. They were not publishing it at the expense of them. That woodblock would have looked something like this. Woodblocks were light and portable. The ATS could have easily given it, this one that was used to print Poor Sarah, to a missionary passing through New York and heading south. What's more, the ATS had no use for this particular woodblock anyway. It was likely just sitting on a shelf collecting dust. And I know that because it is signed with a P. And P is the signature of a guy named Harlan Page. Page was not considered a great artist, by like any standards of the time. The ATS had relied on him for illustrations for the first couple years of its existence. But by 1830, they had almost completely replaced these page blocks with better ones by an engraver who had a better reputation, who was more skilled. So in giving this old page block to the ATS, it was kind of like no sweat off their backs. You know, they just had it like hanging around. It was equipment that they did not need anymore. We're not printing with anymore. They didn't need it. It's also revealing that the ATS and the Moravians are mentioned only in the English translation. So in the Cherokee language imprint, all that is said is the place of publication, New Echota, and the names of the printers using their Cherokee names. Just one note on translation. I'm an extreme beginner. I'm in the middle of taking Cherokee 2 with this amazing Cherokee language program at the language department of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. The instructor is Mr. Ed Fields, and he's very, very good. And it's a wonderful program, and it's also very, very humbling. So if anyone has this knowledge and wants to correct my translations, yeah, please do. But I've tried to do what I can, you know, talking to Ed and using dictionaries. What I think is happening here is that in constructing the material format of the tract in this way, Boudinot was deliberately mimicking the appearance of American Tract Society tracts. He also intended that this formatting decision would have different effects on the two main audiences he envisioned for this tract, which are white settler observers on the one hand, and also Cherokee readers inside Cherokee Nation on the other. So I'll start with what Boudinot was saying to white readers. First, he is flattering missionaries with an outsized attribution of patronage. And then also, and I find this really important and really weird, he's letting readers of English think that this is an ATS tract, when in fact it's not. Overall, Boudinot's 1833 format is deliberately visibly a white media format packaged for a white audience. If the imprint information says discursively, we Cherokees are associated with this evangelical publisher in New York, you know, this prestigious evangelical publisher in New York, the materiality of the tract absolutely shouts an even stronger message, which is, we Cherokees are just like you. You know, we read the same literature, our literature looks the same, it's the same. The format of Poor Sarah hopes that white people will look at the tract and they will recognize it, and it will be legible to them, and legible in a split second as a tract. And thus the tract hopes to perform through its materiality the possibility of Cherokee Christian civilization and assimilation to Anglo-Protestant norms. This was a political strategy to win white allies exactly at a time when the nation was under extreme duress in the lead up to removal. Boudinot knew that format could not force or compel a certain kind of response. You know, this is not like a kind of like a strong power, but that doesn't mean he didn't try to coax that response with a great deal of finesse. It's kind of like Meredith McGill talks about how from today you can tell from a distance of 20 feet whether a given printed text is like an encyclopedia or a novel or a comic book. You know, you just know that, you don't have to reflect on it. That's what Boudinot was counting on when he was making this tract. He was anticipating that Anglo-Protestants would immediately recognize it as like, oh, this is an Anglo-Protestant, or, you know, this is a tract, period. You know, this is it. That it would read as that kind of typical Anglo-Protestant style. At the same time, this tract would have also had a Cherokee audience. And unlike the white audience, many Cherokee readers would have actually been able to read the interior text, which is entirely in Cherokee set in the syllabary. I think that Cherokee readers would have been more sensitively aware to the fact that Poor Sarah was different than the other tracts in their language that they had seen before. So I've been able to reconstruct a bit about Cherokee readership, especially using the Phoenix. So for one thing, it's clear to me that churches and missionaries bought these materials that were coming off the press and were distributing them to their congregations. For another thing that's kind of a little bit more interesting is that Cherokees themselves formed these tract and book societies that bought Cherokee language tracts and distributed them to other Cherokees. So what you're seeing here is this is an announcement with a reproduction of the constitution of one of these tract societies in Cherokee Nation. This is announcing what was called the Valley Towns Bible and Tract Society. It's Baptist affiliated. I've been able to find at least 2 other tract societies. One was a Methodist tract society, The other was called the Brainerd Book Society, and that's ABCFM affiliated. But they all shared a similar kind of structure, which is that these were Cherokees who ran them and who had subscribers. And the subscribers would pay a certain fee, and then they would get tracts from the New Echota Press at a discount. And then those subscribers would go and distribute the tracts, probably for free, I'm guessing, to other Cherokees, like unconverted Cherokees in their community. At least one case that the Phoenix tells us about is that one of the Cherokee tract societies had hired a man to be paid a salary to go house to house and distribute these tracts to other Cherokees. So this is the Phoenix. It's a reprinted letter from a missionary named Isaac Proctor. And Proctor says this: the Cherokee members of this church, which is a church in a place called Carmel, and those of the church at Hightower have formed societies to hire a Cherokee brother to go as their missionary into those dark towns north of us. I'm guessing that's like towns that don't have a church there, the dark towns, to carry Bibles, tracts, and hymn books. We therefore want to know when we can obtain all these and what will be the prices. So what I gather from this is that Cherokee readers of Poor Sarah would have had prior experience with Christian tracts. They would have been aware then that Poor Sarah was exceptional. You know, if they were coming into contact with these other tracts, by the time they got Poor Sarah, they would have known that this was a little off. Remember that all the other Christian tracts looked like this on the left. They were smaller, they had no images, they had a totally different layout. Further, many Cherokees likely would have been recently made aware of what ATS tracts in particular looked like. And this is because though the ATS did not make extensive donations to Cherokee Nation, it did make one very significant donation, and that was sometime between May 1832 and April 1833, which is the exact interval right before Poor Sarah was printed. They send 1,250 tracts to Cherokee Nation, which is the largest single pre-removal donation they ever made. So what I take from this is that Cherokee readers of English would have come into contact with ATS tracts already. They would have been aware that Boudinot's Poor Sarah was deliberately mimicking the ATS's Poor Sarah. If for white observers, the format of the tract worked almost precognitively at an instant, you know, they didn't have to think about it very much because they had seen so many of these things and they were like, oh yeah, that's a tract. For Cherokee observers and readers, it would have registered as different. It would have spurred a slower and more self-conscious reflection on the similarities between it and the ATS tracts that they had only recently beheld. Boudinot was also perhaps asking his Cherokee readers to see themselves as the sort of readers who read Anglophone-style tracts, even encouraging them to take on the persona of a reader of Anglophone-style tracts and become the sort of people who the tracts promise them to be. That's a little more speculative. So let's move then to discuss the second edition and to the final part of the talk. If Boudinot's 1833 tract was a format bent on legibility to Anglo-Protestants, both to white observers, if the tract was a format bent on legibility as an Anglo-Protestant style tract, both to white observers and to Cherokee readers, what was the goal then of this 1843 tract? Why does the revision look like this? So the first thing to know is that by the time the second edition gets published, Boudinot is dead. What happened was that shortly after the publication of Poor Sarah in New Echota, Boudinot came to believe that removal could not be fought, and he decided that it was time to start negotiating it. He published editorials to that effect in the Phoenix, and as a result, he becomes deeply, deeply unpopular. He's relieved against his will of his editorship at the Cherokee Phoenix. Later on, in late 1835, Boudinot was part of what was called the Treaty Party, and he personally met with representatives of the US government, and he signs the removal treaty. The interpretation of this history is really contested. It's subject to ongoing revision. To some Cherokees at the time, and also today, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Others believe that he had no choice, really, and that this was going to happen, whether it was on Cherokee terms or not. In any case, after removal happened, Boudinot was killed by his political enemies, along with many other members of the Treaty Party. Printing continued after removal. John Wheeler, who was that white printer, the first pressman who came to train the other people in the printing shop, he actually went out ahead before the Trail of Tears, and he reestablished Cherokee printing, first in this small town in Arkansas, and then he moved to Park Hill very shortly thereafter. John Candy then comes a little bit later, just like a few months later. He joins Wheeler in Park Hill, and they work together like they did before. Then in 1840, so some years pass, then in 1840, Wheeler flees because he had been part of the treaty party and he's worried for his life. So Wheeler flees and Candy is left in the printing shop. And from 1840 to 1848, Candy is like the head printer in the printing shop. So he's making all the decisions, all the formatting decisions. He's the one who's in charge. Unlike Boudinot, on whom there's reams of secondary scholarship, there's very, very little on Candy. One of my research tasks is to learn more about this shadowy figure. So if anyone has any tips on Candy, I'm all ears. Under Candy's leadership, the Park Hill Press was exclusively devoted to pamphlet printing. Some people might have heard of the newspaper that's the inheritor of the Cherokee Phoenix. It's called the Cherokee Advocate. And that's printed in Tahlequah, which is 5 miles away, but Park Hill is where the pamphlet printing was done. And that's what I'm focusing on here. As in New Echota, most of the pamphlets were, again, Christian materials. And one of these was, as you can see here on the right side of the screen, the 1843 second edition of Poor Sarah. What's most striking to me about this renewed post-Boudinot edition is that it's very much a reversion in format to the standard formats that Cherokees had been printing. It's back to the miniature scale. The image is still there, which means that Candy must have physically taken that block from New Echota and brought it with him to Indian Territory. But he's done this weird thing, which is turn it 90 degrees so that it can fit within that standard Cherokee format. And what this tells me is that the ability for an image to fit within that standard Cherokee format was more important to him than to have an image that you could see straight on. So he was like willing to sacrifice kind of like image clarity, like on the altar of format. Format was what was important to him. So that's an interesting, stakes of format there. Almost all of the layout elements from the 1833 tract are erased in this edition. And also just in general, the tract has fewer English words on it. All that's left really is this short title at the very, very top. Candy and the post-removal printers have also scrubbed Boudinot's name off the tract. And the only name that remains is John Candy's. So in the bottom red box, it just says Park Hill, Candy published this. I don't yet know the significance of this, but just it's worth stating that Candy also changed the title slightly. So the earlier edition translated to something like the pauper Sarah Selly, an Indian woman. And the new one, the Indian woman is gone. And now it's something like, Poor Sarah, the pauper Selly, a biography. So I don't know what this means. If anyone has ideas, I'm interested. The new Poor Sarah no longer relied on the formal resemblances of the ATS tract as an object. And it was also extremely successful this way. It became tied with just one other publication as the most printed text that Candy printed at Park Hill in the 1840s. At first, he printed 5,000 copies, and in the same year, he extended that edition by another 3,000 copies, which indicates to me something of the demand for it, if he's printing it more. And then also, from some like copy-specific evidence, this is like the copy at the Gilcrease Museum that during COVID, Renee Harvey had very kindly taken a picture of and sent to me. But if you can see the image, it's barely like taking the impression anymore. Like it's super faded. So this must be like late in the print run. So basically what Candy's doing is he's printing this block over and over again until it basically can't be printed anymore. He's wearing it out. And he prints it until basically it's the end, even kind of past the point of decent quality printing. One other bit of evidence we have to indicate its positive uptake in Indian Territory is that in 1848, the principal chief, John Ross, personally laid a copy of it in the cornerstone of Cherokee Female Seminary in Park Hill. And this is especially significant because Ross was like Boudinot's sworn mortal enemy. They're on opposing sides of the removal debate. It's Ross's party that carried out the killing of Boudinot. And that this new addition was not tainted by its association with Boudinot, who Ross regarded as a traitor, is because Candy had thoroughly reconstituted, had thoroughly renewed its format. Poor Sarah no longer references Boudinot. It no longer makes a Boudinot-style argument either, either to white observers or to Cherokee people about Cherokee assimilation to white Protestant norms. Now that the Eastern land had been lost and the 1843 Poor Sarah had no need to do the same, now that the land had been lost, this new version doesn't have the same kind of need to do that same kind of political work that its predecessor did. It continued to have a politics. It still represented an effort among some Cherokees to promote Christianity and literacy, or English language literacy, or excuse me, Cherokee language literacy. But the crucial difference was that this printed performance no longer relied on a studied enactment of Anglo-Protestant forms. To read the format of Poor Sarah is to analyze how Cherokee printers, especially Boudinot and Candy, theorize their situations through the materiality of religious media objects. In the case of the first edition in New Echota, format names a sophisticated way in which Boudinot engaged in social and political action, in line with many of the ways he attempted to perform civilization and assimilation as political strategies to assert sovereignty at a time of extreme duress under US imperial aggression. The design of his 1833 tract was intended for Anglophone settler observers to see the tract and to register it as a tract. For Cherokee readers, the format of Poor Sarah would have been strikingly different from the other Christian syllabic tracts that had come before. Thus, the tract would not have elicited mere acceptance, kind of in that precognitive way, but rather active reflection on what Boudinot was trying to do in publishing it. Then, when Candy produces the second edition in 1843, after removal, he too designed his format to have effects on readers. And I think here he was mostly concerned with his Cherokee readers. By contrast to the first edition, the second edition is doing double duty among Cherokee readers. It simultaneously invited recognition and aimed to unsettle, aimed to register difference. The readers who had migrated from New Echota and experienced the first Poor Sarah there, who had otherwise viewed the first edition, through copies that had come through the migration, would have recognized that difference. They would have seen what Candy was trying to do. They would have seen how Candy sought to distance his publication from any association with Boudinot and from Boudinot's studied imitation of white Protestant textual conventions. Okay, this is my last slide. At the same time, Candy expected Cherokee readers to pick up the tract and regard it as nothing really special. The format now was to be routine. It was not supposed to call too much attention to itself. Reformatted into the standard Cherokee format, Poor Sarah was simply ordinary. It was just one tract in the Park Hill printing office's repertory, one object among a family of other objects like it. That's what I have for you. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
There we go. Thank you so much, Sonia. That was a really fascinating talk. And we'll, at this point, open it up to the Q&A portion. I'll mention that because this is a hybrid event, when there's a question from the audience, I'll go ahead and restate it into the microphone so that people attending through Zoom can hear it. And I'll also be paying attention to the chat in the Zoom room. So if you are attending virtually, please feel free to put a question in the chat, and then I can keep an eye on that and read it aloud. So yeah, Laura.
Right. paper conservation?
Yeah, I mean, that just be what it's about. And but I have another question, more about the larger context of the tracks. What is the relationship between Cherokee tracks, the American repository tracks, and the British tradition? I was flipping through as you were talking images of the
Mm-hmm.
are still being distributed in America by the Society for Professional
These are great questions, which I will not be able to summarize perfectly. But two questions were raised. One is about whether the sideways printing of the image is more about deprivation of resources and preservation. And the second question was about whether Dr. Hazard can tell us about comparisons between American tract printing, Cherokee tract printing, and British tract printing.
Yeah, well, so on the first question, typically I'm right there with you. Like I'm a boneheaded materialist most of the time. So I'm always like looking for the materialist explanation. And I've considered that. And I think in this case, I would say no, because the surface area is still the same of the pages, because the smaller tract has to be longer to accommodate the text. It's not saving paper. And also they had, they shared a supply chain with the Cherokee Advocate in Tahlequah, and they were printing like, big full sheet size, so paper is a scarce resource, but I don't know, maybe not as scarce as we think. Certainly the ATS was getting all of its inspiration from Britain. And their goal was really to do what the Religious Tract Society and then the Cheap Repository Tracts before that had done in England, but for America. And of course, in the United States, the task is a lot trickier because America's a lot bigger. But they're citing all the same, like all of their main series of tracts, they're basically cribbing that directly from British prototypes. So this kind of like culture of reprinting is what Meredith Miggles calls it. It was like it was like the Americans were copying the British people, and then like the Cherokee Nation is like copying the ATS, and all that copying was certainly transatlantic.
There's no British Cherokee
line. Not that I understand. And so what I understand, and I guess I'd have to do a little bit more research on this, is that once the ATS really gets going, they so have the market covered that anyone there are other people printing tracts, but there's no reason to import tracts at the same kind of scale from like an organization like the RTS. Which they really see as a complementary missionary partner. Like there's no need to like compete with them, because they're producing really similar looking materials, so better to do it from New York where it's cheaper and there's no import taxes. But yeah, certainly this is like a transatlantic phenomenon. And poor Sarah was super popular in England and Ireland.
Okay, there's a great question, which I don't know if you'll be able to answer, but someone, let's see, it's Susan McVicker asks, thank you for the exciting research and wonderful talk. Where is the woodblock of the image of poor Sarah now?
Oh, that's a really good question. I have no idea. I mean, it's not printed after 1843. So, my guess is that once it's like worn out, it's just old equipment. Few decades on, somebody comes in and is like, what's all this crap? Let's get rid of it. But I like thinking that it's still around somewhere. But yeah, that's just information that I sadly don't know.
Another question from the chat. Historian William McLaughlin mentions handwritten translations of biblical passages that were passed hand to hand among Cherokees in the early 1820s. Do you know if any of these have survived?
Oh gosh, that's also something I would love to know. So yeah, I mean, the one way I can start to answer that is one thing that I would like to acknowledge is that this print culture did not like supersede a manuscript culture. In New Echota, there was this really thriving, manuscript culture that was very complementary in many ways to the print culture. And that's the manuscript culture that this questionnaire is asking about. In terms of survival, I don't know yet. I will say that it's been a lot more difficult for me to locate printed materials that were used by the Cherokee community because they did not easily pass into archives. Most of the kind of the provenance records of the Cherokee tracts that I've looked at kind of hit a full stop at some missionary or sometimes a Bureau of Indian Affairs agent. And typically those copies are pristine. They were never used. So I'm always looking at these things for marginalia and for evidence of response in the Cherokee community, and I'm frequently disappointed.
I have a methodological question about reception, which I was thinking about because this talk is so much about covers of tracts and less about content of tracts. And when you put up that amazing image of the rapid fire tract dissemination, which is you get a tract and you get a tract and you get a tract. I was thinking about how a closed tract is, of course, very different from a tract that one actually opens. And reception is all about what it means to open the thing. But openness itself has such affective breadth. And of course, there's analogy between opening an object and the openness of oneself to that object, which might actually not be particularly friendly, right? Openness to the point of wanting to know what's inside, but not necessarily being particularly inclined to identify with what's inside. And I was wondering, and of course, this then is one of the most difficult things to deal with in studying reception, is trying to account for the breadth of what openness to the content of a text means and can look like, and how to figure out then what the nature of one's encounter with that text really means for them. And again, whether identification with the tract will in any way actually come into play for that reader. So I wonder if you could talk just about how you tackle that issue of reception history and how you look for this question of what it really means to open and be open to a text.
That's a very Don James question, making my materiality into metaphors, which typically I don't like. But so I think so if I can detect in there a bit of your skepticism is that I don't really look at content, and partly that's just my particular alertness to material things. Partly it's my language skills. It's also partly thinking about Porcera in particular. I will say that if Boudinot wanted to translate a narrative story about an Indigenous person, he did not have a repertoire of stories to choose from. The ATS only published 2 narrative tracts about Indigenous people. The second one was about an Ojibwe woman, and that came out in 1840. So he didn't, if he wanted to do something like an Anglophone style tract, and it was about an Indigenous person, Porcera was really it. Also, if he got the block accidentally, it would have made sense for him to just do Porcera. So there's part of me that doesn't want to make too much of a meal out of just what Porcera is, what it meant to people. And then the other part is that kind of what I'm getting at about the precognitive elements of Porcera is I actually think that openness is not a prerequisite to something having an effect. I think that, we tend to think of a book as this kind of long temporal experience where you immerse yourself. And I'm actually saying for these material texts, if they were to work correctly, especially on the white settler readers, you didn't need any of that. You didn't need a reception history or a history of reading. You don't need Stanley Fish. You just need to see a tract and just have it ping on you. And I'm saying that it's that kind of just pinging, that kind of precognitive, very not intellectual engagement with the closed object that does cultural work that we should think about as well. I don't know, I'm sure that's not satisfying to you though.
No, I think it is, it resonates with everything that I found really incredible about this talk. even as I think that I'm also very interested in this question of reception. And, I'm interested in how one answers those questions.
Cherokee reception history, I will say, is like a bit trickier because you'll see in the talk that I do speculate a bit and I try to do it in a responsible way. But I do feel like kind of uncomfortable, to use like a weak word, of like speculating too far about Cherokee reception in the absence of like really strong textual evidence. So I'm kind of like navigating around tricky questions of reception there too. That's just kind of another thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah, Dr. Latham.
I like to speculate. But especially when it's not familiar with this period pretty well, and trying to take a hard argument about the way things might hang on you, or what are some of the other, you showed us children's books, but what are some of the other formats that this thing would have been circulating among that would mean differently? You talked about I just want to get a better sense of that.
Oh, yeah.
Media universe,
mm-hmm.
in which I think I need better that better.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question if Dr. Hazard can expound a little bit more on comparative formats and how other types of formats give us a sense of the unique nature of the ones discussed today.
I think to really answer that question, it's a really long answer because there's a lot of media formats. But so like in my own career though, I've been really focused on pamphlets and not books. In part because I think that the pamphlet is a really interesting media object in the 19th century. And typically what pamphlets indicate is a few things: cheapness, ease of circulation, and typically pamphlets are trying to convince you of something. So just among a tract-like looking thing, you basically got religious stuff from evangelicals that's trying to convert you or to get you to stop drinking or something. And then you've got political stuff that's trying to convince you to vote for so-and-so. And then you've got, and then you also have bureaucratic documents, like annual reports and stuff like that. So when people saw pamphlets, those were kind of the genres that they were primed to experience. But they were primed to see these things as kind of ephemeral. They're not the kind of things that you would put on a shelf and keep forever. They're the kinds of things that you would circulate from hand to hand, that you might read and pass to somebody else. And then I think pamphlets, I guess the real clear contradistinction to that would be bound books, which in 1833 still were something of kind of a luxury object. Prices are coming down, but they're still out of reach for most working people. You might have a few books or a Bible, but you wouldn't have a full shelf of books. So that's when pamphlets become more accessible, those kind of cheaper genres. I don't know, I could go on just spinning the web of different kinds of media. What I've tried to do in the talk is think about what kind of media would be in Cherokee Nation. And I guess to get more specific about that, you'd have these Christian pamphlets, both English language and Cherokee language. You'd have Bibles that were probably bound in English. You'd have Cherokee language parts of Bibles that would be unbound. And you'd have these newspapers, the Phoenix, kind of like the big sheet. And then you'd have all these non-print materials too, right? Like manuscript, wampum, landmarks, storytelling. And in short, yeah, a whole host of media things. Does that not get at what you're asking? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to think more about that one. Because certainly you would not be using the Gospel of Matthew to line your birdcage, likely, Yeah, I'll have to think more about that one. Kind of in Cherokee Nation, well, in Anglophone style tracts, a tract is meant to be ephemeral, but maybe in Cherokee Nation, in the absence of binding technology, the tract actually becomes something more permanent, because they didn't have that binding technology on the nation, Yeah, okay, I'll have to think more about that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, Dr. Ortel.
I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that not as acute in Indian Territory as New Echota. What makes you?
Well, I'd love to hear more about where you're going with that. But my thought is that lots of the treaty party members who are really thumping in that strategy are actually being murdered. So that would be unattractive. And then Boudinot, who's really like emblematic of that political strategy, is no more. He's gone. And then they still certainly are, embattled in sovereignty, but the kind of like the main war has come to a close. They lost. So all those factors come to make me think that perhaps they're kind of like turning away from that sort of strategy. But here, I've just got this one data point. So, ideally, I would be able to kind of move it. Not for a long time.
She suggests that the Cherokee and other members of the tract were very much themselves as civilized, in contrast to Comanche and other resident tribes who live their own life, right? So I'm not sure, perhaps the audience, whether their civilized status has changed, but I think it's still
right in play. Okay, yeah, thanks for that. Because I don't want to overstate that. It's more like I'm still kind of trying to like spin out, like, like why would they have taken the English off? Why does it no longer look like an Anglophone style tract? In grasping at trying to answer those difficult questions, that's what I've kind of like ended up, stepping into. But as you point out, yeah, there's a larger context that I should bring in. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, absolutely.
There is another question in the chat. Do other pre-removal Cherokee tracts exist? Any originating with missionaries who were not associated with the ABC-FM, for example, with Evan Jones?
So, one thing in the Cherokee language, they're really affiliated with the ABC-FM because it's the ABC-FM that helps in assisting with the delivery of the press and the types. And what's crucial about that is that once they get these types, they have the ABC-FM as allies and they're talking to them in the printing office, but it's really just the Cherokees in the printing office who control what they're printing in their language after that point. And so they're friendly, those printers in the printing office were friendly with the ABC-FM, which is why there's that connection there. But the other missionaries do not have that same kind of alliance. So I can think of, I think it was Baptists tried to do some printing in the Cherokee syllabary, but when they did that, they had to resort to using lithography, which is not printing with type, but it's like a process using drawing, and then it's like a contact process using a stone. And the thing is, it produces far fewer impressions. Like with a lithograph, you maybe get 500 impressions, and with using movable type, you can get several thousand. So basically, that means if you're any other kind of missionary group that wants to print in the Cherokee language, you cannot print at scale. You've got to print using lithography, which is super expensive. And for most missionary groups, it was not really worth it. So it was the ABC-FM and that kind of alliance with the printed types that really kind of made the ABC-FM prominent kind of in Cherokee print culture. But because, nobody else could compete. They didn't have the types. They didn't have the material equipment to be able to do that kind of thing.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. And thanks again to Dr. Hazard for this talk.
Thank you. This was my pleasure. Thanks very much for the suggestions.